Okay, it's time for part 2 of Lab A, Chapter 10 of the CCNA Security, working with basic configuration of Cisco ASA 5505 Adaptive Security Appliance. In part 1, what we did was, I'll bring up the picture, we cabled the network and we set IP addresses on the interfaces on the routers. We set up static and default routes, and we also configured our console and our VTY interfaces and our enable password on our routers. So now it's time to move to configuring the ASA device. I also want to point out that I decided to switch my laptop from PC A to PC B. So now my laptop is connected to switch to S2 in the topology diagram. So now my laptop is PCB connected to S2 in the diagram. And you'll see why I did that as we go through the lab. Also, since we're going to be working with the adaptive security appliance, here it is, the ASA 5505, we're going to need to move the console connection from the router to the ASA device. So I'm going to grab the console cable and I'm going to put it in the console port on the ASA device. Now I'm consoled into the ASA 5505. All right. So now I can go to my terminal window. I'm using TerraTerm here, and TerraTerm Pro, and if I hit enter now, I should see the ASA device, and I do. So you can see that now I can see the ASA device right here in the terminal window. So that's good. So now it's time to configure the device. So I'll type enable, and I need a password, Cisco, and let's see here, that didn't work. How about class? All right, there we go. So now I'm in the ASA device and I'm in privileged user mode. And it's time to cover some of the basic commands that we're going to be using on the ASA 5505. First of all, if I do a show command and I put in a question mark, I can see all of the show commands that are available to me, just like on the iOS command line interface on a Cisco router or Cisco switch that we're used to using in the Cisco Academy. If I want to exit out of this show listing, then instead of doing Control-C on the keyboard, I need to hit Q on the keyboard, and that will escape me out of a command halfway through. So now, if I want to, let's do show, and then I'll type VER, and then I'll hit tab, and you can see that I can also do tab completion just the same as the iOS CLI. Okay, so show version. Let's look at the show version command. We can see our operating system. There's the bin file for the ASA operating system. You can see the amount of RAM the device has, flash memory, the BIOS flash memory. You can see here's the MAC addresses and the Ethernet ports that are available. You can see here that Ethernet 00 and the MAC address for it. You can see all the way up to Ethernet 07. So there's 8 Ethernet switch ports on the ASA 5505 device. You can see their MAC addresses here. Also, we can see that maximum physical interfaces, there they are, 8. VLANs, 3. We basically are going to have an inside, an outside, and a DMZ VLAN available to us. VLAN 1, VLAN 2, and VLAN 3. Okay, what else? We can see that we have VPN DES enabled, DES enabled, VPN 3DES and AES enabled. You can see that total VPN peers, 25 possible, and that's what's possible with a base license. And you can see here that we're running the base license on this ASA 5505. You can also see our configuration register right here. All right, let's do a show file system command. And you can see there's the file system with prefixes, flags. All right, let's do a show flash command. Look at our flash memory. In here, there's, once again, there is our ASA 842-K.bin. That's the iOS for the device. You can see here there's ASDM-645.bin. That is the Security Device Manager, Adaptive Security Device Manager file. You can see here AnyConnect for the Mac OS X, Linux, and Windows. And if we want to escape out, we hit Q on the keyboard. All right, So now that we've done that, let's do a show run command. Just like on the iOS CLI, on a router or a switch that you're used to using in the Cisco Academy, you can do a show run and see the running configuration. You can see here enable password, the host name, the domain name, the enable password. Notice that it is encrypted by default. All right, and many other commands. I'm going to once again hit Q on the keyboard to exit out of that. So what we're going to do right now, we've looked at the running configuration file. We're going to go to global config mode now so we can configure the ASA device. So if I do a conf T, which is short for conf tab configure ter tab terminal, we go to global config mode, just as the same as with the iOS CLI. The ASA CLI, same thing. Conf T configure terminal will get us to global config mode. And then one of the useful commands that you can use in global config mode is configure factory, I'm going to use tab completion there, factory-default. And if you put in this command, it will put in the default configuration that comes with the ASA 5505. Unlike some of the routers used in the Cisco Academy and switches used in the Cisco Academy, the ASA 5505 default configuration has pre-configured interfaces, pre-configured DHCP services, and many other things like pre-configured VLANs. The switch ports are pre-configured, and a lot of other things. So you can see here, management interface is set to 192.168.1.1 by default. You can see here that DHCP auto config, enable inside, all of that, it looks like is enabled by default. So that's the default configuration. So now that we've run and basically set the factory default configuration, let's wipe it out and start from scratch. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a write erase command to erase the configuration and then restart the router and start from scratch. So what we'll do is we'll say write space question mark, and you can see here that if I put in the erase command, it will clear flash memory configuration. That'll basically clear our startup configuration. So we'll do that. We'll say write erase, hit enter, and it says, do you want to erase configuration in flash memory? We'll hit enter to confirm, and we just erased the startup config. We'll do a show start, and you can see it says no configuration. So once again, we're in part 2 of the Lab A in Chapter 10, basically configuring the ASA security appliance. Okay, so we erased the startup configuration, and now what we want to do is we want to reload or restart the ASA device. So we'll hit reload, and system config has been modified, save, we'll hit N, and then hit enter to confirm, and you can see that now we're experiencing basically the shutdown and restart of the ASA device. Now, as you reload the Cisco ASA 5505, after deleting the startup configuration file, try to refrain from hitting the keyboard, hitting the enter key on the keyboard. Also, notice here, there is the break or escape key, which will take you to raw and monitor mode. But like I was saying, I'm going to not touch the keyboard as it's restarting because we erased the startup configuration file. And when we come out of the reload, we're going to be met with a pre-configuration wizard, which is going to ask us to set up some basic commands or some basic settings on the ASA 5505 that will help us get started when there's no configuration file. It'll just take a couple more seconds here. Okay, total NICs found. There are the default features. All right, notice what it says here. Pre-configure firewall now through interactive prompts. So the ASA 5505 didn't find the startup configuration file, so it's asking us if we want to go through a pre-configure, basically a wizard. And so we'll just hit enter for yes. And firewall mode routed, we'll accept that. We want to be in routed mode. Enable password, we're going to set it to Cisco. Allow password recovery, yes, we'll hit enter. It sees the year, so we'll hit enter, the month, enter, day, and time. I'm just hitting enter. and now the management IP address. So we'll configure that ourselves here. We'll say 192.168.1.1 and the net mask 255.255.255.0, hit enter. And now we're going to set the host name. Now in the part 2 of the lab, it gives some suggestions here, so we'll just follow the lab, asa-init, and the domain name, generic.com, and the IP address of the host running the device manager. This is the IP address of the host that will be connecting to the ASA device through graphical user mode to configure the device. Now, we could put in our IP address, and then we would be able to, let's say, install the SDM, the ASDM tool, but we don't need to do this, and in the lab, it says just to skip this, so we'll just hit enter, and we won't do that. Now, the reason for that is we can actually use the graphical user management tool just running a web browser from our client. We don't need to install a separate application to do that. All right, and it says use this configuration and write to flash. We'll hit yes. And so those are just some basic settings to help you get started. And you can notice that the host name has now changed to ASA-init, just as we set. So now, if we type enable and put in our password, Cisco, that should get us to privileged user mode, and it does. So we set some basic settings, but if we do a show run command, you can see there's our host name, our domain name. Notice the enable password is encrypted, just like I said it would be. And none of our interfaces are configured, but there is our management interface. You can see interface VLAN 1. So it's a virtual interface, a VLAN interface, and the name for the interface is management, security level set to 0, and the IP address 192.168.1.1, which we told it to use. Now, there's a lot of other settings here that have been set by the ASA device by default. Security settings that you can see that are set here by default. So if we want to save all of these default settings that the ASA device has set for us, we need to save our configuration file. So I'm going to do a copy, run, start to save the configuration. I'll hit enter. And so now we've saved the configuration file, and we should be able to reload now and maintain that configuration. Let's give it a try. We'll hit reload and hit enter. And now once again, the ASA 5505 is going to reload, and when it comes up, it should say ASA-init, and we should maintain our configuration. Once it's finished reloading, we're going to continue to configure the ASA 5505 from the command line interface, and we're going to do it with a bunch of different commands. We'll configure our interfaces, we'll configure NAT, we'll configure DHCP, we're going to configure the web tool so that we can use a graphical user interface to manage the device through a web browser, all kinds of stuff. Right, and this should come up in a second.